At my own retirement dinner, my wife told 65 guests I'd worked 40 years and ended up broke and useless. My 3 children clapped along with her, and for a moment I just let the sound wash over me. The way you let a storm pass before you speak. They thought silence meant defeat. They had no idea I'd already signed something that morning that would change everything. When the room finally went quiet, I gave them a reason to wish it hadn't. But let me start from the beginning. I'm glad you're here for this. Before we dive in, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're doing right now. Working, relaxing, or maybe avoiding a difficult conversation. I read every comment. And your voice matters. Quick note, some details here have been shaped for storytelling. What truly matters is the lesson at its core. 65 people watched my wife tell the room I'd wasted 40 years ending up poor and useless. And my children stood to applaud. I was 64 years old, standing at the front of Brookland Community Hall with my hands in my pockets because I didn't trust them not to shake. Lorraine Finch, my wife of 40 years, held the microphone like she'd been born for this moment. At 63, she moved through the crowd with practiced grace, the kind that came from 1,000 charity galas where she'd learned to smile while cutting someone down. 40 years of honest work, she said, her voice carrying over clinking glasses. Ending in poverty and uselessness. The silence had weight. I felt it press against my chest as 65 guests shifted in their seats. Some looked at their plates, others stared at me, waiting. Then Vivica stood. 39 years old, my eldest daughter, wearing a suit that cost more than I'd made in a month when she was born. She worked at a law firm downtown, the kind with marble floors. Her hands came together in slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the hall. Thane joined her immediately. My son, 36, perpetually between ventures, always one pitch away from making it big. His applause was louder, almost enthusiastic. Soleil, 26, the youngest. She hesitated. I saw it. One visible moment where her hands stayed in her lap while she looked at me. Something flickering across her face that might have been shame. Then Vivica leaned down and whispered something sharp. And Soleil stood too. Her claps were soft, mechanical, but they were there. 3 people applauding in a room of 65. The sound was obscene. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there feeling the weight of the document I'd signed that morning pressing against my chest. They didn't know. None of them knew. Finally, Vivica murmured to Thane, thinking I couldn't hear. But I'd spent 40 years in crawl spaces and under sinks. You learn to hear what people say when they think you're not listening. You need to understand it wasn't the insult itself that broke something in me that night. It was the applause. It was watching my children celebrate my humiliation like they'd been waiting for permission. I let myself remember. 40 years ago. Lorraine had introduced me at her book club as doing repair work, nothing special. I'd been 30 feet underground that day, replacing a sewer line in freezing mud. 28 years ago. Vivica told her law school friends her father was between things. I'd been working 70-hour weeks to cover her tuition. 16 years ago. Thane deflected questions at his college graduation. Dad fixes pipes, he'd said with a shrug. That's all you need to know. He'd introduced his roommate's father, a hedge fund manager, with 15 minutes of glowing detail. Each instance small, deliberate, building a wall of shame around the work I did. The trade I'd learned from my father, the honest labor that had paid for their schools and their contempt. I'd fixed the mayor's burst pipe at 2 in the morning. I'd volunteered teaching apprentices at the community college. I'd built a reputation in Brookland, Washington, D.C., as the plumber you called when you needed it done right. But at dinner parties, Lorraine introduced me vaguely. At family gatherings, my children changed the subject. At their friends' weddings, I became invisible, the quiet man in the ill-fitting suit who didn't understand talk about market trends and vacation homes. How many times can someone introduce you as just doing repairs before you start believing you're invisible? I stopped believing it about 15 years ago. That's when I started making other plans. The applause died. Guests looked away uncomfortable. Lorraine returned to her seat beside me, her hand brushing my arm like we were still a team. Like she hadn't just announced to everyone we knew that I was worthless. I felt the vibration in my pocket before I heard it. Short, insistent. I pulled out my phone. RT office. The caller ID was plain, professional. The preview showed 2 words. Documents finalized. Rufus Trent, my financial advisor for the past 15 years, the one my family had never met, never heard about, never knew existed. The man who'd helped me build something in silence while they built their assumptions about my failure. I had maybe 3 seconds before Lorraine noticed. Her instincts were sharp. She could smell secrets the way I could smell a gas leak. The phone buzzed. RT office. I had exactly 3 seconds before Lorraine reached me. I swiped the message away, deleted it, and slid the phone back into my pocket. But Lorraine had seen me move. She always did. Who was that? Her voice was low, meant just for me, but it carried an edge. Nothing, I said. My voice came out steady, neutral. Work thing. Her eyes narrowed. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect suspicion. You're retired, Harlan. What work? I met her gaze and said nothing. 40 years of marriage had taught me that silence could be a weapon if you knew how to wield it. She didn't know about the work. Didn't know about the documents I'd signed that morning in Rufus Trent's office. The ones that would change everything. Didn't know that while she'd been planning this party, this public execution disguised as celebration, I'd been planning something else entirely. The message was gone from my screen, but Lorraine had seen me move. Had seen something in my face that didn't fit the narrative she'd just sold to 65 witnesses. What work? Harlan, she asked again, louder now. A few guests glanced over. You don't have work anymore. I smiled. Not the defeated smile of a man who'd just been called useless in front of his community. Something else. Something that made her lean back slightly. Uncertainty flickering across her face for the first time that night. You're right, I said quietly. I don't have that work anymore. But I had other work. Work she'd never known about. Work that had been building in silence for 15 years while she'd been busy being ashamed of me. And tomorrow morning, she was going to find out exactly what I'd been working on. She didn't press me about the phone call that night. Lorraine knew when to let suspicions simmer. But standing there in the emptying community hall, I thought about the moment I'd decided she'd never know the truth. 18 months before that party, my eldest daughter asked me for $12,000, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. Vivica arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon without calling ahead. She'd done that since high school, treated our home like a hotel she could check into whenever convenient. This time she found me in the living room, reading the newspaper with grease still under my fingernails from a morning job replacing a water main. I need $12,000, she said, not even sitting down. Career development expenses, networking, professional wardrobe, you know. I folded the newspaper. What specifically are these for? Her face tightened the way it did when someone questioned her. Dad, I shouldn't have to justify every line item. Do you have it or not? Not, can you help me? Not, I hate to ask. Not even, I'll pay you back. Just, do you have it or not? Like I was an ATM that required the right tone to dispense cash. It's a lot of money. Viv. You helped Thane with his startup last year, she said. There was an edge now. 15,000, if I remember correctly. I'm asking for less. She'd been keeping score, tracking what I gave her brother, calculating what she was owed. I wondered if she had a spreadsheet somewhere. columns for each sibling, running totals of parental investment. That was different, I said quietly. Thane had a business plan. And I have a career. She checked her phone. Already half done with this conversation. Look, if you can't afford it, just say so. I can ask Mom to dip into her account. That was the knife. Slipped in so casually I almost didn't feel it. She knew Lorraine's account was just household money I deposited every month. Knew I was the only one earning. But she'd phrased it like Lorraine had independent wealth, like I was the obstacle between her and family resources. When did my own daughter start treating me like a bank that required no thank you note? I got up and went to the desk where we kept the checkbook. The good checkbook, the one linked to our primary account, not the other accounts, not the ones in Maryland. Not the trust fund Rufus Trent had been managing for 15 years. The one that had grown from $40,000 to something Vivica couldn't imagine her simple plumber father possessing. I wrote the check. $12,000, the numbers crisp and clear. Vivica took it, glanced at the amount to verify, and folded it into her purse. "Thanks," she said, the word perfunctory. Then she was checking her phone again. "I've got to run. Meeting at 4. She was gone in under 10 minutes. Didn't ask how the business was going. Didn't notice the new scar on my hand from where a pipe wrench had slipped last week. Didn't see me at all, really. Just saw the checkbook, the signature, the means to an end. I sat there for a long time after she left, looking at the check register. $12,000, written out to my daughter who'd spent less than 10 minutes in my house. That evening I went to my workshop behind the house. It was a converted garage, insulated and organized the way I liked things, tools on pegboards, parts in labeled bins, a workbench scarred from 4 decades of use. This was where I came to think, to work with my hands, to remember who I was when nobody was watching. I sat on the workshop stool where I'd spent 10,000 evenings and felt something shift from shame to strategy. Vivica hadn't asked where the money came from. She never did. None of them did. They saw the checkbook, saw me write the numbers, and assumed that was the extent of it. Assumed a plumber who'd worked 40 years in Brookland. DC had some savings, sure, but nothing substantial. Nothing worth mentioning at dinner parties. They didn't know about the commercial properties in Maryland. The ones I'd bought during the recession when everyone else was panicking. Didn't know about the equity stake in my supplier's distribution company. Offered to me 15 years ago when they needed cash and I had it. Didn't know about the trust fund. Structured and sheltered and growing. They thought I was simple. Hard-working, but simple. Good with a wrench, bad with money. The kind of man who'd die with a modest 401k and a paid-off house. I'd let them think that. Hell, I'd encouraged it. Never corrected Lorraine when she sighed about our limited means. Never contradicted the kids when they worried about my retirement. Just kept my head down. Kept working. Kept the accounts separate and the paperwork filed in a safety deposit box they didn't know existed. But sitting there in my workshop that night, I understood something new. Their dismissal wasn't just casual cruelty. It was assumption. They'd decided who I was, simple, limited, quietly struggling, and they'd stopped looking, stopped seeing. I'd become invisible. Not because I was worthless, but because they'd already written the story of what a plumber could be. You have to understand this wasn't about revenge, yet it was about survival. I was 63 years old. I'd built something real in silence while they'd been busy being ashamed. And I realized that night, watching sawdust drift through the light from my workbench lamp, that my invisibility was the most valuable thing I own. They wanted simple. I'd give them simple. They wanted a father who was a checkbook with no questions asked. Fine, but they'd never know the rest. Never know about Rufus. Never know about the trust. Never know that the man they saw as barely scraping by had more in assets than they'd earn in a lifetime. I locked the workshop that night. knowing exactly what I'd keep hidden and why. The trust fund Rufus managed, the properties in Maryland, the equity stake, all of it. Invisible. They wanted to see me as simple, so I'd be simple. Until the exact moment simple became useful. That moment came sooner than I'd planned, but the foundation was laid 15 years before the party. When I sat across from the only man I trusted and asked him to help me hide money from my own wife. Rufus Trent, 65, sat behind a desk crowded with law books and old photographs from when we'd both worn uniforms. We'd served together in Lebanon, back when we were young enough to think we were invincible. He'd gone to law school on the GI Bill. I'd learned plumbing from my father. But we'd stayed friends through the decades, the kind built on shared foxholes and the understanding that some bonds don't need weekly phone calls. "You sure you don't want to tell Lorraine?" Rufus asked, tapping his pen against the trust documents. "This is a lot to keep secret. She'd find a reason we needed the money for something else," I said. "She always does." I'd come to his Capitol Hill office with $15,000 in certified checks. Money scraped from 3 years of overtime, weekend emergency calls, and jobs Lorraine never knew about. Under-the-table repairs for cash. Quick fixes for neighbors who paid in hundreds. "What I'm proposing," Rufus said, "is an irrevocable trust. Your name only, completely separate from marital assets." "Good," I said. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "Harlan, this isn't a savings account. It's protection," I finished. "From a family that thinks I'm invisible." Rufus studied me, then nodded. "All right, let's build you something they can't see." The first investment was a duplex in Silver Spring, Maryland. 15,000 down, 2 units generating $1,200 a month in rental income, after mortgage and maintenance. I cleared maybe $300 in profit, but it was $300 that didn't exist in Lorraine's world. Didn't get earmarked for the kids' activities, or the kitchen renovation, or the vacation she wanted. You might wonder why a man would hide his success from his own family. But you need to understand what happens when your wife treats your career like a shameful secret. Every dollar I made visible became a dollar she could redirect toward erasing my profession. Better furniture so guests wouldn't know we were blue-collar. Private schools so the kids wouldn't mix with those kind of children. Memberships at clubs where plumbers only came through the service entrance. So I made my money invisible too. 2 years later, 2010, a rental property in Tacoma Park. Rufus found the deal, an estate sale. Motivated sellers. A house that needed work. I did the plumbing myself. Hired out the rest cheap. Had it rented within a month. 2012, a third property. 2015, a construction firm I'd done work for needed cash to expand. They offered equity instead of payment. Most contractors would have demanded money. I took the stake. "Construction equity cleared," Rufus told me. "You're at $1.2 million now." I was standing in my workshop, covered in pipe grease, and I had to sit down. $1.2 million. More than Vivica would make in 5 years at her law firm. More than Thane had ever dreamed of. And Lorraine had just told her book club I was struggling with the transition to an aging body and declining prospects. Each property was a brick in a wall between who they thought I was and who I actually had become. 2018 fourth and fifth rental properties. Bought in a package deal. 2020 Rufus restructured everything. Maximizing tax efficiency. "Keep it all under the trust," I told him. "Lorraine never asks about my overtime." She didn't ask because she didn't care. I could work 80 hours or 40, and as long as the household account had enough for her spending, I was fulfilling my function. By this year, the portfolio had reached $2.8 million. The duplex in Silver Spring was paid off and worth 4 times what I'd paid. The Tacoma Park rental had appreciated. The construction equity had multiplied. The other properties generated steady income that Rufus reinvested. Growing the trust, like compound interest in a bank account no one knew existed. "Portfolio hit $2.8 million, Rufus said in our last review. "Still want total silence?" Absolutely, I told him. But keeping that kind of secret for 15 years takes discipline. And discipline sometimes slips. 6 months ago, I was in the kitchen reviewing a property statement on my phone when a text from Rufus appeared. Tacoma Park tenant renewal. $50 month, good news. I heard Lorraine's footsteps half a second before she entered. Not enough time to lock the phone, barely enough to swipe the notification away. The phone lit up with Rufus's name exactly as Lorraine walked in. My thumb moved fast, deleting the preview, darkening the screen. But she'd seen the movement, seen the way I'd reacted like I'd been caught. "Who was that?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. "Just work stuff," I said, keeping my voice level. "Old client." She moved closer, eyes going to my phone, still face down on the table. "You looked nervous. Since when do you get nervous about plumbing calls?" "I'm not nervous," I said. But my hand had gone to the phone, protective. Lorraine's eyes narrowed. She didn't ask to see it, didn't demand an explanation. Just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, calculation mixed with suspicion. "Right," she said finally. "Work stuff." She left the kitchen. But I felt the weight of that look for hours. I watched Lorraine's eyes narrow at my locked screen, at the speed with which I'd made that message disappear. She didn't ask again. She didn't need to. She'd started watching me differently after that night, paying attention in a way she hadn't in years, not the kind that comes from renewed interest or affection, the kind that comes from a hunter who's spotted tracks she doesn't recognize. I should have known then that the clock had started, that my 15 years of perfect silence had just developed its first crack. And cracks, in my experience, always spread. Lorraine wasn't the only one watching. 6 months before the party, while she studied me for secrets, I watched her transform into someone who suddenly cared about her appearance in ways she hadn't since our wedding. It started with the gym membership. For years, Lorraine had belonged to the basic community center, $25 a month, treadmills and weight machines, nothing fancy. Then one morning I found a charge on our joint account for $85. Prime package at Vitality Fitness, the upscale place downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and trainers who looked like they'd stepped out of magazines. "I need to invest in my health," she said when I asked. "The premium package has personal training. 3 sessions a week seems like a lot." 3 hours, she corrected, not looking up from her phone. "There's stretching, showering, socializing after. You wouldn't understand." She was right. I didn't understand why a woman who'd spent 40 years in comfortable disinterest suddenly needed personal training at 63. Didn't understand the expensive athletic wear that started appearing in her closet, tight leggings and form-fitting tops that cost more than my work boots. But I understood the way she came home from those 3-hour sessions. Energized, glowing, checking her phone with a smile I hadn't seen in years, taking calls in other rooms, keeping her screen face down, deleting message history every night before bed. I'd been a plumber for 40 years. You learn to spot leaks before they flood the house. When your wife stops caring if you notice she's lying. What does that tell you about how little you matter? Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the premium membership started. I stood in my workshop and laid out what I knew. Lorraine had upgraded her gym membership without discussing it. She was gone 9 hours a week for workouts that should take 3. She'd bought a new phone plan with unlimited data and started guarding her screen like it held state secrets. She showered before going to the gym, now full makeup, careful hair, perfume, and showered again when she came home. The evidence pointed one direction. The kind of direction that in another man's life might have led to screaming matches and thrown dishes and lawyers called in anger. But I wasn't another man. I sat on my workshop stool, surrounded by tools I'd used for 4 decades, and thought about Rufus's advice from years ago. Information is more valuable than reaction. If I confronted Lorraine now, she'd deny it. We'd fight. She'd get defensive. Maybe confess, maybe not. Either way, she'd file for divorce on her timeline, not mine. She'd hire a lawyer before I'd sign the papers Rufus was preparing. She'd go after the house, the accounts, everything she could see. And she'd never know about the rest. I'd spent 40 years being dismissed what were 6 more months of pretending not to see. The retirement party was already on the calendar. Lorraine had insisted on it. Wanted to invite the whole neighborhood. At the time. I'd thought it was strange she'd never celebrated my work before, but sitting in my workshop that night, I understood. She wanted witnesses. Wanted a public ending to our marriage that painted her as the long-suffering wife of a man who'd failed to provide. Wanted to walk away with sympathy and assets, while I looked like the loser who'd wasted her best years. If I confront her now, she divorces me on her timeline, not mine, I said to the empty workshop. The words hung in the air, mixing with sawdust and the smell of pipe compound. I've waited 15 years to use my silence. I can wait 6 more months. 6 months to let Lorraine get comfortable. To let her think I was too simple to notice. To let her build her narrative while I built my own plan. Let her think I'm too simple to notice. Let her get comfortable. And comfortable she got. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became routine. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Saturday mornings. She'd leave the house dressed like she was going somewhere that mattered, claim she was meeting a friend for coffee or running errands or hitting the gym. But the errands didn't align with purchases. The coffee dates never left receipts. The gym visits lasted 4 hours sometimes, when even the most dedicated workout topped out at 90 minutes. Meeting a friend for coffee, she said one Thursday, car keys in hand. Don't wait up. Which friend, I asked, not looking up from the newspaper. Her irritation flashed quick and sharp. Does it matter? You never remember their names anyway. She wasn't wrong. I'd stopped tracking her social circle years ago, when it became clear those friends saw me as the embarrassing husband who talked about pipe fittings at dinner parties. But the dismissal in her voice, the way she didn't even bother to lie convincingly anymore, that told me everything. She'd stopped caring if I noticed because she'd already decided I didn't matter. I was the husband-shaped obstacle between her and whatever new life she was building. Soon I'd be the ex-husband she complained about to sympathetic friends over wine. The indifference hurt more than the deception. You might think I should have confronted her immediately, demanded truth. But that would have been her victory, not mine. So I watched. I noted. I kept a mental ledger of every unexplained absence. Every phone call taken in another room. Every time she came home from the gym, glowing in ways sweat couldn't explain. I started recognizing the pattern. Tuesday evenings, she'd be gone from 6 to 9:30. Thursday evenings, 7 to 10. Saturday mornings, 9 to 1. Regular. Scheduled. The kind of consistency that came from someone's work schedule, not random socializing. Someone who had set hours. Someone she was meeting deliberately. Someone who thought they were being careful. I started keeping that mental ledger the same week I found the gym receipt. I didn't know yet that I'd need it at a retirement party 6 months away. But first, I needed proof I couldn't deny. Evidence that would make what came next feel justified instead of cruel. And Lorraine, growing more comfortable in her deception every day, was going to give it to me. The proof I'd been waiting for arrived gift-wrapped in carelessness. The receipt fell out of her purse while she was in the shower. $147 at a Georgetown steakhouse. That was the night she'd claimed to have dinner with her diabetic sister, who hadn't eaten at a restaurant in 3 years. I stood in our bedroom holding the slip of paper. 2 filet mignons, 2 glasses of Cabernet, appetizer to share, dessert. Her sister couldn't eat any of it. Diabetes had put her on strict diet restrictions in 2018. But someone had eaten filet mignon with my wife that Tuesday night. I photographed the receipt, put it back exactly where it had fallen, and went to my office. The phone bill was due anyway. I'd been meaning to review it for a property management call I needed to expense. But as I scrolled through itemized charges, a different pattern emerged. One number. Called and texted repeatedly. Hundreds of times. 847 text messages. I counted every single one on that phone bill. 6 weeks of records. 14 calls per week average. Late nights, early mornings, always when I was at work or in the workshop. I typed the number into a reverse lookup. Dashiell Kemp. Personal trainer at Vitality Fitness. I sat back and felt something settle in my chest. Not surprise I'd known, not even pain. Just cold, clear certainty. My wife of 40 years was having an affair with a personal trainer young enough to be our son. Information is more valuable than confrontation. I said to the empty office, quoting Rufus, "Don't react, prepare." I saved the phone records to a flash drive, printed the lookup results, added them to a folder in my workshop, locked in the bottom drawer of my toolbox. Evidence. Not for a divorce I planned to file, but for a revelation I was beginning to choreograph. 3 days later. Lorraine brought up downsizing over morning coffee. "We should think about downsizing," she said, casual as discussing weather. "This house is too much for 2 people our age." I looked up from the newspaper. "We've been here 23 years. Exactly." She smiled that practiced smile. "Time to simplify, reduce our debt load, prepare for retirement properly." We didn't have a debt load. The mortgage was paid off. "What brought this on?" I asked. "I've been thinking about our future." She refilled her coffee, not meeting my eyes. "We're not getting younger. Smaller house, lower taxes, less maintenance. We could take that equity and actually enjoy our retirement. How do you react when you discover your wife has been preparing your financial destruction with the same care she used to plan anniversary dinners?" I recognized what I was hearing. Divorce positioning. Establishing a narrative of financial strain. Mutual agreement to liquidate assets. Preparation for splitting everything down the middle. She wanted to sell the house before retirement. While it could be framed as practical planning instead of marital dissolution, wanted the equity liquid for clean division. Wanted to simplify finances so there'd be less to untangle when she filed papers. And she had no idea about the rest. No idea about the Maryland properties, the trust fund, the construction equity, the portfolio Rufus managed that had grown to nearly $3 million. She was planning to divorce a plumber with 1 house and modest savings. Maybe $50,000 in visible assets after the house sale, split to $25,000 each. She didn't know she was planning to divorce a man worth nearly $3 million. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't take too long." Edge in her voice now. "These decisions are easier when we make them together." Together. The word was almost funny. "When's your retirement date again?" she asked. "June." 4 months, I said. "Perfect timing then. We can list the house right after, start fresh." She kissed my forehead like we were still the couple in our wedding photos. "I'm meeting Rebecca for yoga. Back by lunch." "Rebecca? Sure." I waited until her car pulled out, then went to my workshop. 4 months until retirement. 4 months until the party she was planning. The one she'd mentioned last week, a nice celebration, she'd called it. Invite the neighbors, your old colleagues, mark the occasion properly. I'd thought it strange. Lorraine had never celebrated my work, never acknowledged the 40 years I'd spent building a business, a reputation, a life in this community. But now I understood. She wanted witnesses, wanted a public transition from our life together to his retirement, our new chapter. Wanted to establish the narrative before filing papers. Wanted everyone to see the devoted wife supporting her husband. So when the divorce came, she'd have sympathy locked in. Here's what people don't understand about betrayal. The pain is temporary, but the clarity is permanent. I pulled out the folder from my toolbox. Added notes about the downsizing conversation, dated and detailed. Reviewed what I had, restaurant receipts, phone records, text message counts, a pattern of absences that aligned perfectly with Dashiell Kemp's training schedule. Everything I needed to prove the affair. And everything Rufus needed to prove the trust fund was separate property, untouchable in divorce. I marked my retirement date on the workshop calendar in red ink 4 months away. Beneath it, I wrote 2 numbers. The first, $2,800,000. The second, $147. One fortune she didn't know about. One receipt she'd forgotten to hide. Both were going to matter at that party she was planning. The celebration she thought would be her stage for gracious transition. I was going to make it something else entirely. 4 months. I could wait 4 months. I'd waited 15 years to build an empire in silence. What were 16 more weeks of letting Lorraine think she was in control? Let her plan. Let Dashiell Kemp plan. Let them imagine their future together. Funded by half of what they thought I had, I'd be ready. And on that retirement night, in front of all those witnesses she wanted, I'd show her exactly what 40 years of underestimating me had cost. I didn't have to wait long to see what they were working toward. The first test came exactly 1 month after I marked that calendar. 3 months before the party. My daughter called asking for $18,000 like she was ordering takeout. I need $18,000, Vivica said. No hello, no how are you. Professional development, conferences, proper business wardrobe for partner track. I was in the workshop when she called. Organizing pipe fittings. I put down the wrench and sat on my stool. Which conferences specifically? I asked. A pause. What? You said conferences. Which ones? I'd like to know what I'm investing in. Dad? Her tone shifted, irritation creeping in. The legal conference circuit, networking events. You wouldn't know the names. Try me. What's with the interrogation? I'm asking for help with professional development. And I'm asking for a breakdown, I said calmly. $18,000 is a lot of money. Viv, conference fees, travel, lodging, wardrobe. What's the split? Since when do you interrogate me like I'm some kind of loan applicant? Her voice went sharp now. You're my father. When did I become the family ATM that required no PIN? No receipt, no thank you. That's exactly why I'm asking, I said. I want to understand what you need. I need you to trust me. I need you to help without making me justify every line item like I'm some stranger off the street. I thought about the last time she'd asked for money. The $12,000 from 18 months ago. The way she'd taken the check without meeting my eyes. Already moving toward the door. Send me a budget, I said. Conference registrations, hotel bookings, a wardrobe estimate. Once I see the breakdown, we can talk. The silence on the other end lasted 5 full seconds. You're serious? Completely. Unbelievable, she laughed. But there was no humor in it. Thane was right. You really are. She stopped herself. But not before I caught it. Thane was right. They'd been talking about me. Comparing notes. I'm what? I asked. Nothing. Forget it. Her voice was ice now. I'll figure it out myself, like I always do. The line went dead. I sat there, holding the phone, replaying that slip. Thane was right. About what? About me being cheap? Difficult? Or about something else entirely? I didn't have to wonder long. The second request came exactly 48 hours after the first. Thane texted asking to meet for coffee. Said he wanted to discuss a business opportunity, needed my advice. I knew what that meant, needed my wallet, but I went anyway. We met at a place near his apartment in Columbia Heights. He was already there when I arrived, laptop open, looking every inch the entrepreneur in his startup casual wear. Thanks for coming, Dad. He stood to shake my hand, which should have been my first warning. Thane never shook my hand. What's this opportunity? I asked, sitting down. Ground floor situation, he said, launching into a pitch about sustainable packaging. Disrupting the industry, massive market potential. He talked for 10 minutes without saying anything concrete. Finally, I need $15,000 for the startup capital. It's a can't-miss situation. There it was. What's the business model? I asked. Revenue projections? Who else is investing? His expression shifted, just like Vivica's had. Confidence to confusion to irritation. Dad, do you trust me or not? I shouldn't have to justify this to you. The same words. Almost exactly the same defensive reaction. I'm asking basic questions, I said. If this is such a solid opportunity, you should have answers. The opportunity won't wait for me to draft a dissertation. He closed his laptop with a snap. I thought you'd want to help your son get ahead. I want to help you succeed, I said. That means understanding what you're getting into. What I'm getting into is a chance to build something real. His voice rose slightly. People at nearby tables glanced over. But I guess that's hard for someone who's spent 40 years fixing other people's toilets to understand. There it was. The dismissal. The casual cruelty wrapped in frustration. I stood up. When you have a real business plan, we can talk. I left him sitting there, his laptop closed, his pitch delivered to an empty chair. Driving home, I let the pieces fall into place. Vivica calls Monday. 18,000, vague on details, defensive when questioned, angry when refused. Thane calls Wednesday. 15,000, same vague pitch, same defensiveness, same anger. Total requested $33,000. Timing same week Lorraine mentioned selling the house. Same week she'd started talking about our retirement plans and simplifying our finances. You need to understand something about betrayal. It's never one person. It's always a system. This wasn't two entitled kids making coincidental requests. This was coordination, testing. They were mapping my liquidity, figuring out how much I could access quickly, how much I had available, how I'd react to large requests now versus later. Lorraine wanted to know what she'd be splitting. The kids wanted to know what they'd be inheriting after the split. And they were all working together to get the information without telling me what they were doing. 18 plus 15 equals 33,000, I said to my empty truck. They're mapping my liquidity. I pulled into my driveway and sat there, engine running, adding it all up. The gym membership, the affair, the downsizing talk. Now coordinated financial probes from both kids within 48 hours? My wife was planning to leave me. My children were helping her calculate the split, and all of them thought I was too simple to notice. I sat in my truck outside that coffee shop adding numbers in my head. 18 plus 15 equals 33,000 in requests. 0 gratitude. And 1 unavoidable conclusion. My entire family was working together. I just didn't know yet what they were working toward. But I had a feeling I was about to find out. I found out exactly what they were working toward 3 days later. Displayed in neat columns and rows, the laptop was open on the kitchen table when I came in for coffee, Vivica's Excel spreadsheet, calculating her share of assets she assumed I'd die with. She must have left it open by accident. I wasn't snooping, the screen was just there, glowing in the morning light. Post-divorce asset division, Finch family. I stood there, reading. Row 3. House equity, $140,000 after mortgage. Row 4. Divorce split 50-50. Mom receives $70,000. Row 7. Dad's estimated savings, $52,000. Row 11. Dad's retirement accounts, $18,000. Row 12. Dad's life insurance payout estimate, $50,000, paid directly to beneficiary, not counted in estate total. Column D, row 12. Dad's life insurance payout estimate, $50K. She'd calculated my death. Row 15. Total Dad's estate upon eventual death, approximately $70,000. Row 16. Three-way split among children. $23,333 each. I scrolled down. More calculations. Projected divorce timeline. Q3 2024. Legal fees estimated at $8,000, split 3 ways if children contribute to mother's case. Another tab. Property rental projections. Monthly income streams. Tax implications. File properties showed last modified yesterday. Created 6 months ago. 6 months of tracking. Updating. Calculating. Dad. I turned. Vivica stood in the doorway, face draining of color. "That's private," she said quickly. "You shouldn't what?" I kept my voice level. "Shouldn't see my own obituary written in Excel. It's not like that. It's just financial planning. Being responsible." "Row 12, I said. "Life insurance payout. You calculated my death down to the dollar." She grabbed the laptop, closed it. "You're taking this out of context." "What context makes this okay?" "Viv, the context where mom needs to know what she's working with. Where we all need to plan for the future." "Your mother's future," I said, "not mine." She clutched the laptop to her chest. "I'm not having conversation." She left. Car started 5 minutes later, engine gunning as she backed out too fast. I sat at the table where her calculations had glowed. $23,000. That's what she thought I was worth to her. She had no idea. 3 days later, Lorraine insisted on family dinner. All 3 kids, both parents. Proper Sunday meal like we used to have. Another coordination meeting disguised as tradition. Vivica and Thane arrived together. Soleil came separately, looking uncomfortable before she even sat down. Dinner was tense. Lorraine played host, cheerful and warm, pretending everything was normal. Then Vivica brought it up. "Dad, we're concerned," she said, setting down her fork. "Your retirement is coming up, and we don't think you have a clear financial plan." "My finances are fine," I said. "Are they?" Thane leaned forward. "Because you couldn't help me with $15,000 for a solid business opportunity. Or me with professional development," Vivica added. "Which makes us wonder if you're more strapped than you're letting on." Lorraine touched my arm. "Harlan, if we're having trouble, we should discuss it as a family. 3 against 1, carefully coordinated." "Maybe we should talk to Dad with more respect," Soleil said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "What?" Vivica's tone was sharp. Soleil's voice was so quiet I almost missed it. But it was the first kind thing anyone in my family had said about me in years. "He's worked really hard his whole life," Soleil continued. "Maybe we shouldn't be pushing him about money like this." "Sol, you don't understand the situation," Vivica said dismissive. "This is about planning. Being smart with limited resources." "Yeah," Thing cut in. "Stay out of grown-up conversations. This doesn't concern you." "I'm 26, Soleil said. "I'm not a child." "Then stop acting like one," Vivica shot back. "This is about taking care of family." I watched Soleil shrink back. Watched the brief spark of conscience get crushed. But I'd seen it. And I filed that moment away. The dinner ended early. Vivica and Thane left together, still talking strategy. Soleil lingered, helped me clear plates while Lorraine took a phone call. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "They shouldn't talk to you like that." "It's okay," I told her. "It's not." She looked at me. "Something's wrong. I don't know what, but something feels wrong." I wanted to tell her. Wanted to show her the spreadsheet, the phone records, the evidence. But I just squeezed her shoulder. "Thank you for speaking up." That night in my workshop, I called Rufus. "The retirement party," I said. "That's when we do it. Exactly 10 weeks from today." "You're sure?" Rufus asked. "Completely. Can you have the donation documents ready?" 8 weeks, he said. "I'll need 8 weeks to structure everything properly. Get the charity paperwork finalized. Make it bulletproof." "Perfect," I said. "That gives me 2 weeks to watch them dig deeper." This is the moment everything locked into place. Not if I'd respond, but exactly when and how. Vivica had calculated 23,000 each. She didn't know about the properties, the trust, the millions she'd never calculated because she'd never imagined her plumber father could possess them. Soleil had tried to defend me. Her siblings had crushed her immediately, but she'd tried. That mattered. That would matter when the time came. Rufus confirmed the donation documents could be ready in 8 weeks. That gave me 2 weeks buffer before the party time to watch them continue calculating wealth they'd never touch. Time to watch Lorraine position for a divorce that would give her nothing. And time to decide whether Soleil's single moment of conscience would be enough to save her from what was coming. Soleil's conscience didn't get the chance to develop. 1 week before my retirement party, my wife served pot roast, and my children served an intervention about my financial incompetence. Lorraine had insisted on the dinner. One last family meal before the big celebration, she'd said. I want everyone there. Everyone came. Vivica and Thane arrived together again, coordinated like always. Soleil came late, apologetic, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. The pot roast was perfect. Lorraine had always been good at presentation. The table looked like something from a magazine candles, good china, the works. The kind of scene that said, loving family, if you didn't listen to the words. We made it through salad before Vivica launched. Dad, we need to talk about your retirement planning, she said, setting down her fork with practiced precision. Have you thought about downsizing, reducing overhead? The house is paid off, I said. But the maintenance costs. Thane cut in, right on cue. Utilities, property tax, upkeep. Mom's been saying the same thing. You're carrying too much debt for your age. I wasn't carrying any debt. They knew that. This wasn't about facts. I just want us to be secure, Lorraine said, touching my hand across the table. Is that so wrong? How does it feel to sit at your own table while your family rehearses your humiliation like a community theater production? We've talked to a financial planner, Vivica continued. Someone who specializes in retirement security. He says people in your position should absolutely consider liquidating real estate, moving to something more manageable. You talked to a financial planner about my finances? I asked. We're concerned, Thane said. You're being defensive instead of listening. Soleil pushed food around her plate, not looking up. Silent, but at least not participating. The party is in a week, Lorraine said. After that, we should sit down seriously, make some real decisions about our future. Our future. Not mine, ours. Except she'd already decided her future. With a personal trainer who thought her plumber husband was too simple to notice 3-hour gym sessions and Georgetown steakhouse dinners. I cut a piece of pot roast, chewed it slowly while they watched me, waiting for agreement or argument or some reaction they could work with. Instead, I swallowed, took a sip of water, and asked, Lorraine, does Dashiell Kemp have an opinion on our financial situation? I said his name like I was asking about the weather. Dashiell Kemp. The room froze. Who's Dashiell Kemp? Vivica asked, looking between us. I kept my eyes on Lorraine. Her fork had stopped halfway to her mouth. Color drained from her face like someone had pulled a plug. Your mother's personal trainer, I said, still calm. The one she's been seeing for 8 months. Seeing Thane looked confused. Like for training, among other things, I said. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, Saturday mornings, usually 3 to 4 hours per session, very dedicated to fitness. My wife. Lorraine set down her fork. Didn't speak. Didn't deny. Just sat there like a deer in headlights. Processing that I knew. Had known. For months. Dad, what do you... Vivica started. 847 text messages in 6 weeks, I said, still looking at Lorraine. I counted. The phone bill is very detailed. Mom. Thane's voice had gone quiet. Is this that true? Lorraine opened her mouth, closed it. looked at her plate. "How long have you known?" Vivica asked me, something shifting in her expression. "Long enough," I said. "Found the first Georgetown receipt about 4 months ago. Did the math after that." "You knew for 4 months." Thane looked between us. "Why didn't you—" "Why didn't I what?" I asked. "Confront her, demand she stop, file for divorce myself." I looked around the table. At Vivica, who'd calculated my death down to insurance payouts. At Thane, who'd called my career 40 years of fixing toilets. At Lorraine, who'd spent 8 months building a life with someone else while planning to take half of what she thought I had. "I was curious," I said. "Wanted to see how it would play out." Soleil had tears running down her face. Silent, staring at her plate. Not shocked like her siblings, just sad. Like she'd suspected something was wrong all along and finally had confirmation. The silence after I named him lasted maybe 20 seconds, but it was the loudest sound my family had made in 40 years. Lorraine finally spoke, the voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I said. Not angry, not hurt, just done. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." I stood up, folded my napkin, set it beside my untouched pot roast. "You've been planning to leave. Probably announce it after the retirement party, right? Public celebration, then private dissolution. Very considerate timing." Vivica and Thane exchanged looks. They hadn't known about the affair. They'd been recruited for financial positioning without understanding the full picture. "The downsizing talk," I continued. "The financial intervention tonight, all positioning for divorce. Making me look incompetent so you can claim you tried to help but I was too stubborn. Building your narrative." Lorraine stood too. "If you know all this, why did I let you continue?" I smiled. "Because I wanted to see how far you'd go, how much you'd calculate, how completely you'd underestimate me." "What does that mean?" Vivica asked, and there was something sharp in her voice now, recognition that maybe her simple plumber father wasn't as simple as she'd thought. "It means," I said, "that 7 days from now, at my retirement party, everyone's going to learn some very interesting things about all of us." I left them sitting there. Lorraine stood from the table without a word, walked upstairs, and closed the bedroom door. My 3 children sat frozen around pot roast none of us had touched. 7 days until the party where everything would become public. I went to my workshop and called Rufus. "They know I know," I said. And nothing changes. We proceed as planned. You sure they might try to stop the party? Cancel it. They won't, I said. Too many invitations out, too public. Canceling would require explanation they're not ready to give. 7 days, Rufus said. 7 days, I confirmed. And then everyone would know everything. They knew I knew, but they didn't know what I'd do about it. That was the advantage I needed for the next 6 days. The morning after naming my wife's lover at the dinner table, I woke to find her side of the bed untouched and Vivica already sitting in my kitchen. She had coffee made, 2 cups, one for her, one waiting for me at my usual spot. The setup alone told me this wasn't a casual visit. "Where's your mother?" I asked, pouring myself coffee. "Hotel, probably. She left last night. Didn't say where." Vivica wrapped both hands around her mug. "We need to talk. About how you've known for months." She looked at me with those sharp lawyer eyes. "About Mom and him. Why didn't you say anything?" I sat down, took a sip. "Sometimes you learn more by listening than by talking." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." She studied me, and I could see her attorney brain working, analyzing, calculating. This wasn't my angry daughter from last night. This was Vivica, the corporate lawyer, recognizing something didn't add up. "You weren't surprised," she said. "Last night, when you said his name, you weren't angry or hurt or anything. You were calm." I've had months to process. Nobody's that calm about their wife having an affair. She leaned forward. "Unless they have leverage. You have to understand Vivica's not stupid. She's a corporate attorney trained to recognize when clients are hiding assets." My phone rang. "Property management," the caller ID said. I'd been expecting the call, tenant issue in Tacoma Park, routine maintenance approval. But the timing was terrible. "I need to take this," I said, standing. "It's 6 in the morning. What kind of plumbing emergency?" "Business call." I walked outside to the backyard. Felt Vivica's eyes on me through the window. "Mr. Finch," the property manager's voice came through. "Sorry to call early, but the Tacoma Park tenant's water heater went out. We need approval for replacement." "How much?" "$1,200 installed." "Do it," I said. "Bill to the usual account." I hung up and turned. Vivica stood at the kitchen window, watching. Not casual observation, analysis. When I came back inside, she was standing. "What kind of plumbing emergency requires you to step outside?" she asked. "Client confidentiality," I said. "You're retired. In 6 days." I met her eyes. "Anything else?" She grabbed her purse, but paused at the door. "That spreadsheet you saw, my calculations, they're based on what I thought you had." "I know." "Are they wrong?" she asked. "The numbers?" "You'll find out at the party," I said. She left looking like she'd just lost a case she thought she'd won. 2 hours later, I was in Rufus's office. "Vivica suspects," I told him. "Suspects what?" "That her spreadsheet is wrong. That I have more than she calculated." Rufus pulled a folder from his desk. "Does it matter? You're signing these in 6 days regardless." The documents sat on Rufus's desk, 23 pages transferring $2.8 million I'd spent 15 years building. "Donation agreement," Rufus said, walking me through it. "Entire portfolio, properties, equity stakes, liquid assets transferred to Veterans Children's Fund. Irrevocable upon signature. Effective immediately. Timeline. You sign morning of the party. I'll be there to witness, provide legal verification if needed." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "Once you sign, there's no reversing this. $2.8 million gone forever." "Not gone," I said. "Just going where it matters instead of where it doesn't. Your family won't see it that way." "My family calculated my death for insurance payouts," I said. "They'll see it however they want. When change the fact that every dollar will be helping kids whose parents served this country." Rufus set down the papers. "How many witnesses do you need at this party?" "Exactly 65, I said. "Already confirmed RSVPs." "Why exactly 65? "Neighbors from the street, 12 households. Former colleagues from the Plumbing Association, 18. Extended family, 8. People from church, 12. Lorraine's book club friends, 10. The community center staff, 5. You've thought this through to the person." "I've had months to think. 6 days to execute." I counted them off on my fingers. 65 people is large enough that the story spreads community-wide by tomorrow morning. Small enough that everyone sees everything. No hiding in the back. No missing the moment. 65 witnesses wasn't a party, it was a jury I'd been assembling for months. "Where do I sit?" Rufus asked. "Back table, near the door. You're not part of the show until I need legal confirmation. And when Lorraine gives her speech, I let her finish," I said. "Let her say whatever she's planned to say. Let the kids applaud if they want, then I respond. With the donation announcement. With the truth," I corrected. "The donation is just part of it. They need to hear about the 15 years of building wealth while they dismissed me. The properties they never knew about. The trust fund she wanted to split that she never knew existed. "It'll destroy them," Rufus said quietly. "They've spent months destroying me," I replied. "Calculating my worth, planning my humiliation, positioning me as incompetent. The difference is, I actually have something to destroy them with." Rufus leaned back in his chair. "I just need 65 people as witnesses, no more." He repeated my words. "That's cold-blooded calculation, Harlan." "It's justice," I said. "Witnessed justice." "And so late." I paused. "She tried to defend me at that family dinner. Got shut down immediately, but she tried. So she's collateral damage." "She's 26 years old," I said. "Old enough to have said something sooner. Old enough to have questioned what her siblings were doing. Her conscience came late. But it came." "Yes," I admitted. "It came." Rufus walked me to the door. Documents locked in his safe until party morning. 6 days, he said. "You sure you want to go through with this?" I looked at my oldest friend, the man who'd helped me build an empire in silence while my family built my funeral in spreadsheets. I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. Being sure and staying sure through execution are different things. But 3 days before the party, Rufus asked why I'd chosen Veterans Children's Fund, and I told him about a 10-year-old girl I'd met in 1983 whose father never came home from Lebanon. We were in his office again, finalizing logistics. Guest list verified, timeline confirmed, documents ready for morning of signing, professional details handled. Then Rufus got personal. "Why this particular charity?" he asked. "You researched dozens." "Because I remember what happens when kids lose a parent and have nothing left," I said. Rufus waited. He was good at that, waiting for the rest of the story. "We were stationed together, 81 to 83, I said. "Before you went to law school. Before I learned plumbing from my father. Young. Stupid. Thought we'd save the world." I remember. There was a family on base. Marine wife, 3 kids, good people. He deployed to Beirut in 83, part of the peacekeeping force. I paused. October 23rd. The barracks bombing. He was one of the 241. Rufus's face shifted. He remembered that day. Everyone who served remembered. I helped his widow move off base 2 months later. I continued. She had 60 days to clear out. Find new housing, figure out how to support 3 kids on whatever benefits came through. The oldest was 10, Sarah. I never forgot her name. That 10-year-old's name was Sarah. I never forgot it. Never forgot how she looked at her mother asking when Daddy was coming home. She stood in their empty living room while we loaded the truck, I said. Asked me if her dad's tools were worth any money because her mom needed to buy groceries. 10 years old. Trying to sell her father's tools to feed her family. "Jesus," Rufus said quietly. "I bought them," I said. Gave her twice what they were worth. Kept 1 wrench. Still have it in my workshop. Reminder that some families get left with nothing. And this charity provides what Sarah's family never got. Housing assistance, education funds, counseling. All the support that falls through the cracks when a parent dies serving. Rufus leaned back. "The $2.8 million, it's not about punishing Lorraine, is it? It's about those kids." "It's about both," I said honestly. "My family spent 40 years treating my work like it was worthless. This proves it wasn't. But it also goes somewhere that matters. Somewhere Lorraine can't touch. Somewhere 40 children can build futures their parents didn't live to see." Rufus nodded slowly. "That's the difference between revenge and justice." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe it's just what a man does when he's finally done being invisible. People think revenge is hot, but real resolution is cold. It's waking up knowing exactly what you'll do and why it matters." The night before the party, I spent 3 hours in my workshop. Not working, just being. I sat on the stool where I'd spent 10,000 evenings and let myself review 40 years. Building a business from nothing. Raising 3 children who'd learned to be ashamed of how they'd been raised. Accumulating assets a family dismissed as impossible for someone like me. I picked up Sarah's father's wrench. Cleaned it, though it didn't need cleaning. Held the weight of it. The reminder of what service costs and what gets left behind. 40 years of work they'd called worthless would fund 40 children's futures. The math had a poetry to it. I looked at my tools, organized on pegboards just like my father had taught me. Every wrench in its place, every fitting labeled. The precision that Lorraine had mocked at dinner parties, Harlan's little shop. So cute how organized he is. Was the same precision that had built an empire she'd never imagined. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned out somewhere between finding the restaurant receipt and watching Vivica's spreadsheet calculate my death. What remained was clarity. Clarity that respect must be earned. That boundaries matter more than comfort. That some people will only understand value when they see what they've lost. My family had spent 40 years treating my labor as worthless. Tomorrow would prove its worth while redirecting it somewhere meaningful. Somewhere it would build instead of feed entitlement. Somewhere Sarah's story wouldn't repeat. I thought about calling Soleil. Wanted to warn her, prepare her, give her a chance to distance herself from what was coming. But she'd had 40 years to speak up. 26 years of adulthood to question why her siblings treated our father like an ATM. 1 week since she'd defended me at dinner. Immediately crushed by siblings who had no interest in her conscience. Her late-blooming decency didn't change the math. The donation was final. The revelation was set. Tomorrow would hurt everyone, including her. I locked the workshop for the last time as an employed plumber. 40 years of being the man who fixed what others broke, ending with one final repair job fixing the respect I'd never received by making it impossible to ignore. 40 years I'd built a wall, brick by brick. Tomorrow, I'd show them what I'd actually been building. The house was dark when I went inside. Lorraine asleep in the guest bedroom where she'd been staying since the confrontation. Vinica and Thane at their own homes. Probably on the phone comparing notes. Trying to figure out what their father knew and what he'd do about it. None of them understood yet. They thought tomorrow was about my retirement, my failure, my quiet exit from a career they'd never respected. They didn't know tomorrow was about revelation. About 65 witnesses seeing truth they couldn't spin or dismiss or calculate away. I set my alarm for 6:30. Earlier than necessary, but I wanted time to think before driving to Rufus's office. Before signing 23 pages that would change everything. Before the party with a whole hall would witness what happens when quiet people finish being quiet. I lay in bed, alone, and felt peace I hadn't known in years. Tomorrow they'd think they were celebrating my retirement. They didn't know I was celebrating my freedom. Freedom from 40 years of dismissal. From a marriage built on shame. From children who loved my checkbook but not my character. I closed my eyes and slept better than I had in decades. The alarm went off at 6:30. I've been awake since 5. The pen was heavier than it should have been. Mont Blanc Rufus had given me when we left the service. And when it touched page 23, $2.8 million stopped being mine. We were in Rufus's office at 7:15. Morning light coming through the window. Coffee cooling in cups we'd forgotten to drink. 23 pages of legal documentation spread across his desk like a roadmap to a place I couldn't return from. "Once you sign page 23, it's done," Rufus said, finger on the final signature line. "Forever." "I know," I said. "That's the point." He watched me sign my name. Same signature I'd used for 40 years on invoices and checks and mortgage papers. But this one meant something different. This one meant Lorraine's spreadsheet calculations were worthless. Vivica's inheritance plans were fiction. Thane's assumptions about splitting modest savings were fantasy. This one meant 40 children whose parents had died serving would get education, housing support, counseling, futures. I signed page 1, then 2, then 3. The properties in Maryland signed away. The construction equity, gone. The trust fund Lorraine had never known existed, transferred. 23 pages, 23 signatures, $2.8 million gone in 17 minutes. Rufus co-signed as witness. Sealed the documents, made copies. The original went into an envelope addressed to Veterans Children's Fund headquarters. "Congratulations," he said, shaking my hand. "You just made 40 children's lives completely different." "And mine," I said. "And yours," he agreed. "No going back now." "Good," I said. "I don't want a way back." He handed me a single folder. "Donation confirmation. You'll need this tonight when you make the announcement. Shows the transfer is complete, legal, irrevocable." I put it in my briefcase. Everything I needed for tonight fit in one slim folder. Everything I'd built for 15 years. Reduced to documentation that would destroy my family's plans in front of the entire hall. "See you at 6, Rufus said. "Back table," I confirmed, "near the door." "I'll be there." I drove home slowly, letting the finality settle. The money was gone. The secret was ending. Tonight, everyone would know everything. And I felt lighter than I had in years. Lorraine was in the kitchen when I got home at 8:30, practically vibrating with energy. She'd had her hair done yesterday. Was wearing a dress I'd never seen new. Expensive. Probably bought for tonight specifically. "Today is going to be so memorable," she said, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly from excitement. "I have a feeling everything changes tonight." "I have the same feeling," I said honestly. She smiled. Genuine warmth I hadn't seen in years. "I'm glad we're finally on the same page about something. You know that feeling when someone's excited about something and you know exactly how it's going to end and they have no idea?" "What time did you leave this morning?" she asked. "I didn't hear go." "Early," I said. "Had some things to take care of." "Last-minute party preparations." She was practically glowing. "I've been finalizing everything. 65 confirmed guests. Everyone who matters will be there." "Everyone who matters," I echoed. "Yes." She spent the morning arranging flowers. Real ones. Expensive ones. From that florist she only used for special occasions. The dining room table became a staging area. Centerpieces for the community hall. Place cards, programs she'd had printed. I watched her work. This woman I'd been married to for 40 years, and tried to remember when I'd loved her. It had been real once, early on, before the shame set in. Before she started treating my profession like a secret to hide. Somewhere in those 40 years, she'd decided being married to a plumber was beneath her. That my work honest, skilled, necessary, was something to apologize for at dinner parties. And now she was planning to publicly declare me a failure, humiliate me in front of the community I'd served, and walk away to a personal trainer who probably couldn't spell irrevocable. "I'm going to go change," she said around 11. "Want to look perfect tonight." "You do that," I said. She paused at the stairs. "This is going to be perfect, Jim. Absolutely perfect." Jim. She'd called me Jim. Hadn't used my first name in months, maybe years, always Harlan or my husband or nothing at all. Jim was what she'd called me when we were young, when she still thought marrying a tradesman was romantic instead of embarrassing. Now she was using it again because she thought tonight would end with me broken and her free. We were two trains heading toward each other on the same track. Both engineers convinced they had the right of way. I spent the afternoon in my workshop. One final time. Looked at the tools I'd used for 40 years. The stool I'd sat on while processing Vivica's entitled demands and Lorraine's affair and my own strategy. Tonight would end this. All of it. The marriage. The pretense. The family who'd calculated my worth in spreadsheets and found it wanting. But it would also begin something else. Proof that 40 years of dismissed labor had value. Demonstration that quiet people can plan just as effectively as loud ones. Evidence that respect must be earned. And boundaries matter. At noon. I went back inside. Lorraine was at the kitchen table, checking her phone, smiling at something. Probably Dashiell. Probably planning their future. Funded by half of assets she thought I had. She looked up when I entered. That genuine smile again, warm and almost tender. "Today will be memorable, Jim," she said. "For both of us." I smiled back. "I think so too." She had no idea how right she was. The party started at 6. We had 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours before the whole room saw what happens when a quiet man stops being quiet. 5.5 hours before Lorraine's carefully planned humiliation became her own destruction. 5.5 hours before my children learned that spreadsheets only work when you have accurate data. I went upstairs to change into the suit I'd bought specifically for tonight. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. Just a good suit for a working man's retirement party. The last party I'd ever attend as someone's invisible, dismissible, calculable husband. The first party I'd attend as a man who'd just given away millions to prove a point about what actually matters. Those 5.5 hours passed like minutes and years simultaneously. And then we were there. The Brooklyn Community Hall smelled like coffee and sheet cake when we arrived. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The hall had been decorated with retirement banners, blue and gold. Probably Lorraine's choice, and round tables filled the space. 65 people, exactly as planned. I recognized faces from 40 years colleagues from municipal plumbing, union representatives, neighbors who'd called me at midnight when pipes burst. Extended family I saw once a year at most. Rufus stood near the back exit, just like we'd planned. He caught my eye briefly, nodded once. Everything was ready. My children were already there. Vivica in another expensive suit, networking with a group of Lorraine's friends. Thane working the room like he was drumming up investors. And Soleil, sitting alone at a table near the side, looking like she wanted to disappear. "Welcome, everyone!" Lorraine's voice rang out, cheerful and warm. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Jim's wonderful career." Jim. She was still using my first name. Still playing the devoted wife. Walter Hutchins, my former supervisor, who'd retired 2 years earlier, stood first to speak. Reading glasses perched on his weathered face. 40 years, he said into the microphone. Not many guys stick it out that long anymore. But Jim Finch is the guy you want on your crew when the storm hits. Always has been. He told the story about the ice storm in 2014. Power out across half of Brooklyn. Temperatures brutal. And I'd worked 36 hours straight making sure elderly residents had heat and water. For 40 years I'd wondered if the work mattered, and here were 65 people saying it did. Grace Caldwell, the union representative who'd worked with me for 15 years, spoke next about safety records and dedication. 0 serious accidents in 40 years, she said. And the pride in her voice was genuine. That's not luck, that's discipline and respect for the work. That's Jim Finch treating every job like it matters. Because to him, it does. She talked about emergency response protocols I'd helped write, training programs I'd contributed to, the younger workers who'd learned from watching me. I glanced at my children. Vivica was checking her phone. Thane was whispering to someone at his table. Only Soleil was watching Grace speak, and there were tears in her eyes. You need to understand this wasn't false praise or obligatory retirement speeches. These people meant every word. Dennis Yates, a younger colleague I'd trained a decade back, told the Christmas Eve story with genuine emotion. Christmas Eve, 2019, he said. I was new, maybe 6 months in. Got a call about a burst pipe at Mrs. Fletcher's place. She's 83, lives alone, and water was flooding her basement, killing her furnace. He paused, looked at me. Most guys would have said it's Christmas Eve. Call emergency services. See you Monday. Jim stayed until midnight making sure Mrs. Fletcher had heat again. Then helped her clean up the water damage, then made sure she had someone to check on her the next day. The room applauded. Real applause, not the polite golf clap you give at corporate functions. That's who Jim Finch is, Dennis finished. The guy who stays until it's done right. I felt something crack in my chest. Not pain, something else. Recognition, maybe. Validation. These people had worked beside me. They'd seen the 3 a.m. emergency calls, the frozen pipes in January, the sewage backups that turned stomachs. They'd seen the work Lorraine dismissed as repair work, nothing special. And they were telling me, telling everyone, that it mattered. I looked at Rufus in the back. He was nodding, a small smile on his face. He knew what this meant. Knew that these tributes made what came next even more powerful. Soleil was openly crying now, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Vivica finally put down her phone, probably realizing she should at least pretend to pay attention. Thane shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Lorraine sat beside me, smiling that tight smile she used when things weren't going exactly as planned. She'd expected polite acknowledgments. Maybe. Not this outpouring of genuine respect. Walter finished by presenting me with a plaque from the union. For 40 years of dedicated service and exemplary character. The room stood. All 65 people, standing ovation. I stood too. Shook Walter's hand. Accepted the plaque. Tried to say thank you, but my voice caught. These people had just told me my life's work had value. My family had spent 40 years telling me it didn't. The applause went on for what felt like a minute. I saw faces in the crowd. People whose homes I'd saved, whose emergencies I'd solved, whose trust I'd earned over decades. And I thought they're about to witness something they won't forget. The applause finally faded. People settled back into seats. The program should have moved to dinner now. Casual mingling, maybe a few more informal stories. But Lorraine stood, smoothed her dress, and reached for the microphone. Walter looked confused, started to hand it to her. She took it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you all so much," she said, voice warm and gracious. "These tributes have been wonderful, truly wonderful." She turned to look at me, and I saw it. The calculation, the confidence, the absolute certainty that she was about to win. "I'd like to say a few words about my husband," she continued. "About our 40 years together." The room settled into attentive silence. 65 witnesses, exactly as planned, waiting to hear what came next. The applause for the last tribute was still fading when Lorraine rose from her seat beside me. She smiled at the crowd, that practiced smile I'd seen her use at 1,000 social events. And then she began to speak. Her speech started exactly as I'd expected. Warm, personal, carefully crafted lies. She didn't walk to the microphone, she glided, her silver dress catching the light with each step, confidence radiating from every movement as though she owned not just this moment, but every moment that would follow. 40 wonderful years, she began, voice warm and tender. When I think about Harlan and me, I remember our first apartment, that tiny place with the leaky faucet he fixed himself because we couldn't afford a plumber yet. People smiled. A few laughed softly. The room settled into comfortable attention, expecting a loving tribute to match the colleagues' speeches. "We've been through so much together," she continued. "Raised 3 beautiful children, built a life in this community, watched each other change over the decades." I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table in front of me. 65 witnesses, exactly as planned. But we all change, don't we? The warmth in her voice shifted slightly, just a degree. Most people wouldn't notice yet. I noticed. Have you ever watched someone you love transform into a stranger right before your eyes? Some of us grow, she said, and now there was something sharper underneath the words. We pursue education, culture, broader horizons. We push ourselves to be more than we started as. The room had gone quieter. People were starting to sense something off. And some of us, she continued, smile still in place, just grow old, content with so little, satisfied with the same small life, year after year after year. I saw faces in the crowd changing. Confusion, discomfort. Walter Hutchins frowned. Grace Caldwell's smile had frozen. I've sacrificed so much, Lorraine said, and the warmth was completely gone now. Travel I never took, culture I never experienced, ambitions I set aside to support a man who never wanted more than his next service call. Someone in the back coughed. The sound was too loud in the sudden tension. Married to someone content with so little, she said. Someone who never aspired to anything beyond fixing other people's pipes. I watched Vivica and Thane. They were leaning forward slightly, faces eager. They knew what was coming. They'd probably helped plan it. Lorraine paused for effect. Looked directly at me. I look at Harlan tonight, she said, voice clear and deliberate. And I think 40 years. 40 years of work to realize you've spent your whole life ending up poor and useless. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was a vacuum. 65 people stopped breathing simultaneously. I sat, frozen at the table. Face drained of color, I could feel it, the blood leaving my cheeks, exactly as I'd known it would. The shock I was supposed to feel, displayed perfectly for every witness. Lorraine smiled. Actually smiled, like she'd delivered a touching toast instead of a public execution. People looked at each other, mouths open, eyes wide. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Poor and useless. She'd said it. In front of everyone, actually said it. Before I tell you what happened next, are you still with me? Comment A if you think I should have walked out right then, or B if you'd stay, and add one short reason. Quick note: what follows contains recreated details for emotional impact. The lesson is what matters. Because after this moment, everything changes. 3 seconds of frozen horror. 65 people holding their breath, waiting for something, anything to break the terrible silence. Then Vivica stood, slowly, deliberately. Her hands came together. Clap, clap, clap. Her face was triumphant, vindicated, like she'd been waiting years for permission to applaud her father's humiliation. Thane shot to his feet, joined her, louder, faster, grinning at his mother like she'd just won an award. Clap, 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 clap. The crowd remained paralyzed. Nobody else moved. Horrified expressions on every face. People looking between my children and me, and Lorraine, trying to process what they were seeing. Only 3 people applauding in a room of 65. The sound was obscene. Soleil stayed seated, eyes down, hands gripping her napkin so tight her knuckles were white. Vivica leaned down, whispered something sharp in her ear. Soleil flinched like she'd been slapped. Thane reached over, grabbed Soleil's arm, physically pulled her to her feet. She stood, mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Her hands came together, soft, barely touching. No sound at first, then quiet claps that seemed to hurt her to make. Her hands moved, but her eyes were somewhere else. Somewhere far away where daughters still loved their fathers. I sat, utterly motionless, staring at nothing. Face blank, no rage, no tears, no reaction at all. Just frozen stillness that scared people more than any explosion would have. Lorraine's smile flickered. Just for a second, she'd expected something, anger, maybe, tears, denial, something she could respond to. I gave her nothing. The applause died. My children sat down. Soleil was crying silently, tears running down her face while Vivica and Thane looked satisfied. Lorraine turned to the crowd, still smiling that practiced smile. "Thank you," she said, like she'd delivered a beautiful tribute instead of a character assassination. She walked back to her seat, sat down beside me. I didn't move, didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. The room remained dead silent. 65 people staring at us. At me. At the 3 children who'd just applauded their father's public destruction. Walter Hutchins looked like he'd been punched. Grace Caldwell's hand was over her mouth. Dennis Yates was shaking his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. Rufus, in the back, caught my eye, gave the smallest nod. Now, but I didn't move. Not yet. Let them sit in this. Let them process what they'd just witnessed. Let Lorraine wonder why I wasn't reacting. I sat completely still. Hands still folded on the table, face still drained of color but expression blank as stone. 65 witnesses had just seen my wife call me poor and useless after 40 years of marriage. 65 witnesses had just seen my children applaud. And every one of them was about to see what happens when a quiet man decides he's done being quiet. They wanted a response. Rage, tears, denial, something they could understand. I gave them nothing. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight, and 65 people waited for it to snap. I sat perfectly still. Hands still folded on the table, face still blank, eyes focused on nothing. Looking through the room rather than at it. Lorraine shifted beside me. Just slightly. The confident smile still in place, but I could feel tension radiating from her. She'd expected reaction. Expected me to explode or crumble or defend myself. The silence extended. 10 seconds. 20. People started glancing at each other. Confused, uncomfortable. The applause from my children had been shocking enough, but my complete non-response was somehow worse. Walter Hutchins stood. His chair scraped loudly in the quiet, making half the room flinch. "Perhaps," he said, voice shaking slightly. "Perhaps this isn't the time or place for—" "Walter." Lorraine's voice cut across him, warm and dismissive. "You're so sweet to worry, but this is just honesty between husband and wife." She smiled at him. That practiced, charming smile that had worked at 1,000 social functions. 40 years together means we can be real with each other, don't you think? She looked around the room. "I'm sure you all understand. Sometimes the truth needs to be said." Walter sat down slowly, looked at me, waited for me to say something, do something. I didn't move. The silence deepened. Silence is supposed to be empty. But this stir on shoulders, squeezed lungs, made the air itself feel solid. 30 seconds. 40. Whispers started. Quiet. Nervous. Is he okay? Should someone? Maybe we should. The whispers died as quickly as they'd started. Because I still hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't acknowledged that anything had happened. Lorraine leaned toward me slightly. Her smile was gone now. "Say something," she whispered. I didn't look at her. 50 seconds. A minute. The room had gone from uncomfortable to unbearable. People shifted in seats, looked down, looked away. Looked anywhere but at me sitting frozen at the front table. My children sat at their table 15 feet away. Vivica's triumphant expression had faded to confusion. Thane kept glancing at his mother, then at me, then back. Soleil stared at her plate, tears still running silently down her face. Rufus remained in the back, perfectly still, waiting. 40 seconds. 50. A minute. Still nothing. I could hear breathing now. Individual breaths from different parts of the room. Someone's watch ticking. The hum of the overhead lights. Sounds that should have been buried under conversation. Under movement. under life. But there was no life in this room anymore. Just 65 people holding their breath, watching a man who refused to react to his own destruction. 1 minute became 90 seconds. Lorraine's hand moved toward mine on the table. Stopped. Pulled back. She was breathing faster now, uncertain. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd humiliated me. The children had applauded. Now I was supposed to break, cry, beg, give her the final victory of seeing me defeated. Instead, I sat like stone. 2 minutes. Grace Caldwell stood abruptly. Started to leave, stopped, sat back down. The movement was loud in the silence, but I didn't react to that either. Someone coughed. The sound echoed. "Harlan," Lorraine said, louder now, not a whisper. "Harlan, say something. Everyone's waiting." I turned my head then, slowly, looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. Her confident smile was gone. Her practiced charm had cracked. What I saw in her eyes was something new. Uncertainty. Fear. Maybe. Because she'd just realized something: she couldn't control me. Couldn't predict me. Had absolutely no idea what I was thinking or what I would do next. For 40 years, she'd known exactly how I'd react to everything. Patient, accommodating, quiet. But this quiet was different. This quiet had teeth. How long can a man sit perfectly still before stillness becomes terrifying? I looked away from her. Back to the room. Back to nothing. 2.5 minutes of absolute silence. People weren't just uncomfortable anymore. They were frightened. Not of violence I hadn't moved, hadn't made a threat, but of the unknown. Of a man who'd absorbed that much cruelty without a single visible crack. What kind of person can sit through their own public execution without flinching? Someone who knows something you don't. Lorraine stood suddenly. "I think..." Her voice came out too loud, too sharp. "I think we should move to dinner. The caterers..." "Sit down," I said. 2 words. The first I'd spoken since her speech ended. Quiet. Calm. Absolute. She sat. The room leaned forward collectively. Finally. Finally, he was going to react. Going to defend himself. Argue. Break down. Something. But I went silent again. 3 minutes. Vivica made a small sound. Frustration, maybe, or fear. I wasn't sure and didn't care. Thane's confident grin had disappeared entirely. He looked pale, young, uncertain. Only Soleil looked at me with something like understanding. Like she alone recognized that my silence wasn't weakness. It was power. The power to make 65 people wait. To make them uncomfortable. To control the room without saying a word. Lorraine had tried to destroy me with words. With public humiliation. With calculated cruelty. I was destroying her plan with absence. With refusal. With the simple act of not giving her what she expected. 3.5 minutes. I could feel Lorraine shaking beside me. Actually trembling. The confident woman who'd glided to that microphone was gone. What remained was someone who'd just realized she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd thought she knew me. Thought 40 years of marriage meant she could predict how I'd break. She was wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours, but had been just under 4 minutes of absolute silence, I took one slow, deliberate breath. The last whisper had died, and the room had held its breath so long that people were getting lightheaded. My chest rose. My eyes focused. My hands unfolded on the table. And every single person in that hall leaned forward. Because after 4 minutes of frozen stillness, any movement was seismic. I was about to speak. And they all knew it. Whatever came next would matter. Whatever I said would change everything. 65 witnesses. Perfectly silent. Waiting for the quiet man to finally make noise. I stood slowly. Deliberately, taking my time. When I stood, the room held its breath. When I smiled, it stopped breathing entirely. Because the smile wasn't broken, wasn't defeated. It was calm, almost peaceful. "Lorraine," I said, and my voice came out steady, warm, even. "Thank you for saying that to everyone here." Confusion rippled through the crowd. "Thank you. You're right that I've worked 40 years. I continued. "You're right about a lot of things." I pulled an envelope from my inside jacket pocket, held it up so everyone could see. "But there's something you don't know." Lorraine's face had gone from uncertain to frozen. She was trying to read me, trying to figure out what I was doing. 40 years of marriage, and she had no idea. I let that moment stretch. Let her wonder. Let all of them wonder. "Something I've never told you," I said. "Never told any of you." I looked at my children. Vivica sat forward, alert now. Thane's confusion was turning to something else, calculation. Maybe. Soleil watched me with red eyes, still crying, but listening. 15 years ago, I said, turning back to the room, addressing all 65 witnesses. I started setting money aside. Not much at first, $50 here, $100 there. Money from overtime shifts, weekend emergency calls, jobs I took that nobody knew about. Have you ever watched someone pull a gun you didn't know they'd been carrying? That's what I saw on Lorraine's face. The recognition that I'd been planning something, building something, hiding something for 15 years. "I invested it," I said. "Carefully, quietly. Properties in Maryland, equity stakes in the businesses I worked with, all managed through a trust fund that my wife and children never knew existed." The room was dead silent again. But this was different from the terrible silence after Lorraine's speech. This was anticipation. "My financial advisor," I said, gesturing to the back of the room. "Rufus Trent. Can confirm the current value." Rufus stood. 65 heads turned to look at him. He nodded once, raised his hand briefly in acknowledgement. $2.8 million. I let those words hang in the air. $2.8 million. The room exploded in gasps, whispers, shocked exclamations. I watched my family's faces change in real time. Lorraine's mouth opened, closed, pulling again. Her eyes went wide. I could see her brain racing. $8 million. Marital assets. Divorce settlement. Half of that would be. Vivica's shock lasted maybe 3 seconds before her expression shifted to something sharp. Interested. Her spreadsheet calculations had been catastrophically wrong. She'd estimated $70,000 total. The actual number was 40 times that. Thane leaned forward so far he almost fell out of his chair. His face had gone from pale to flushed. "Dad, you have—" "Had," I corrected. I had $2.8 million. That word "had" didn't register yet. They were too busy calculating, too busy seeing dollar signs, too busy planning how they'd spend their shares. I saw it clearly on all 3 faces. The hope, the greed, the immediate shift from humiliation to avarice. My wife had just called me poor and useless in front of 65 people. My children had applauded. And now, hearing about millions, they were looking at me like I'd just become valuable again. "Properties," I continued, watching their faces. 5 rental units across Maryland, equity in a construction supply company, a trust fund that's been growing for 15 years, while you all assumed I was barely scraping by. Lorraine's hand moved toward mine on the table. Not to hold it, to claim it, to assert her right to half of what I'd just revealed. "Harlan," she said, and her voice had changed completely. Soft now, almost tender. "Why didn't you tell me we could have—" "Could have what?" I asked. "Used it, spent it, treated it like the household account you've been depleting for years." Her hand stopped. "I didn't tell you," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "because I knew exactly what would happen. You'd find a reason we needed it. A bigger house, better cars, more expensive vacations. Ways to spend money that proved you weren't married to a plumber. The room was listening to every word. 65 witnesses hearing not just about hidden money, but about why it had been hidden. Greed is ugly. But greed on a daughter's face when she looks at her father is something else entirely. Viveka's eyes were bright, calculating. She'd already moved past shock to strategy, probably thinking about legal angles. Marital property law, her mother's rights to assets accumulated during marriage. Thane was simpler. He just saw money. Lots of it. More than his failed ventures had ever dreamed of. His father, the plumber he'd dismissed, was sitting on millions. Even Soleil, sweet Soleil, who'd hesitated before applauding, who'd cried through the whole thing, even she had that flicker of hope in her eyes now. The hope that maybe, just maybe, this meant something good for her. None of them were thinking about me. About the 40 years of work. About the humiliation I'd just endured. They were thinking about the money. And that's exactly what I'd wanted them to think. So yes, I said, turning back to Lorraine. You're right that I worked 40 years. But you're wrong about what it got me. I'm not poor. I paused. Let them have one more second of hope. Well, I said, I wasn't poor until this morning. That landed different. Confusion again. Wasn't Lorraine's hand reached across the table toward me, not in apology, but in claim. Viveka and Thane leaned forward in their seats, eyes bright. Even Soleil's expression had shifted, hope flickering where shame had been moments before. They all thought the same thing. The money exists. We can get it. This changes everything. Rufus remained standing in the back, perfectly still, waiting for what came next. And I smiled. Because they had no idea. No idea at all. They were still calculating shares when I fired. The word "but" can be a bullet, and I fired it with a smile. But, I said, and the room shifted. This morning, I signed papers donating every dollar of it to the Veterans Children's Fund. The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. This wasn't anticipation or shock or horror. This was the sound of hope dying. Every dollar. I repeated. Slower now, making sure every single person heard. 2.8 million. All of it. Effective immediately. Lorraine's reaching hand stopped midair. Froze there, like she'd been turned to stone. Viveka's mouth opened. No sound came out. Thane blinked rapidly, like he was trying to reset his brain. Rewind the last 10 seconds. Hear different words. The Veterans Children's Fund. I continued, pulling the folder from the envelope, holding it up. Helps kids whose parents died serving this country. Provides housing assistance, education funding, counseling. Everything those families need when they lose everything. I looked directly at Lorraine. Not 1 cent to my wife or children. They made it very clear tonight they don't need it. Every single dollar. Viveka found her voice first. You can't, that's marital property. Assets accumulated during marriage. We'll sue. Try, I said calmly. Rufus can explain why that won't work. Rufus stood again. All 65 heads turned to him like he was about to deliver a verdict. As Mr. Finch's attorney, he said, voice clear and professional. I can confirm all documentation was executed at 9 a.m. this morning. He pulled his own folder from his briefcase, held it up. The trust fund was established 15 years ago as separate property, funded entirely from documented separate income streams. Properties purchased in Mr. Finch's name only, with separate financing. The legal structure has been reviewed by 3 independent attorneys. Lorraine's face had gone from frozen to draining, color leaving her cheeks like water down a drain. The transfer to Veterans Children's Fund. Rufus continued, is complete and legally irrevocable. Thane stood up. There has to be some kind of, you can't just give away. There is no mechanism for challenge or reversal, Rufus said. Mr. Finch had absolute legal right to donate assets he alone accumulated and owned. The charity has already been notified. The transfer is final. I watched my family process this. Watched understanding hit them in waves. First wave. The money exists. That was real. Second wave. It's gone. Every penny. Third wave. He did this before the party, before Lorraine's speech, before their applause. Watching someone's dream die is like watching ice crack. You can see the exact moment the surface breaks and everything falls through. I saw it happen on 3 faces simultaneously. Vivica's sharp calculation shattered into raw fury. Her spreadsheet had been wrong. Her inheritance plans had been fiction. Everything she'd thought she knew about her father's worth had been catastrophically incorrect. And now, knowing the truth, it was gone. Thane's entrepreneur confidence collapsed into something younger, desperate. He'd seen millions, had them dangled in front of him, and watched them vanish before he could touch them. Soleil just cried harder. But I saw something different in her tears now. Not just grief. Shame, maybe. Recognition of what they'd all just revealed about themselves in front of 65 witnesses. You did this morning. Lorraine's voice came out strangled. Before the party. 7:15, I said. Signed 23 pages transferring everything. Been planning it for months. Her hands, still extended across the table, started shaking. So when you called me poor and useless in front of everyone, I finished. Yes. I already knew I'd given it all away. Already knew you'd get nothing. Already knew that your little speech was meaningless. Lorraine's hand was still extended across the table, but now it looked like she was drowning and reaching for air. You let me, she whispered. You sat there and let me. Let you reveal exactly who you are, I said. Let you humiliate me publicly. Let our children applaud, all while knowing that every word out of your mouth was based on calculations that were 40 years out of date. I stood up, addressed the room. My wife called me poor and useless, I said. My children applauded, and all of you witnessed it. 65 heads nodded. Some people looked angry on my behalf. Others looked horrified at what they'd seen. But here's what they didn't know, I continued. I spent 15 years building something worth millions. And this morning, I gave every penny to kids whose parents died serving this country. Kids who deserve it more than people who calculated my death for insurance payouts. Vivica flinched. How did I the spreadsheet? Of course. So yes, I said, turning back to my family. Lorraine's right. I am poor now. Gave it all away. But I'm not useless. I just made sure 40 children have futures. I looked at Rufus. He nodded. And I made sure my family understands something important. I finished. You can't calculate a man's worth in spreadsheets. You can't measure it in dollars. And you certainly can't claim it after spending 40 years treating him like he's invisible. The room was dead silent. No applause this time. No whispers. Nothing but the sound of my family's plans shattering. Vivica's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Thane's face had gone white as paper. Lorraine sat frozen. Her perfectly styled hair and silver dress suddenly looking like a costume on a mannequin. And 65 people watched them realize what they'd lost. Not just the money. Their calculations. Their assumptions. Their certainty that I was too simple to fight back. All of it gone. All of it revealed as fantasy built on 40 years of dismissal. I'd given away millions to prove a point about what actually matters. And watching my family's faces collapse in real time, that was worth every penny. The sound that came from Soleil wasn't a scream. It was something smaller, something broken. A gasp that turned into a sob, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the screen. For one strange moment, I thought she might apologize. Her eyes met mine across the crowd, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Actual recognition that I was a person, not just a wallet. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Dad, I'm so sorry." But before I could process it, Vivica's voice cut through the room like a chainsaw. $2.8 million. She wasn't crying. She was shaking with rage, her face flushed dark red. "You gave away $2.8 million! Thane was right behind her, his voice rising to a shout. "That was our money! Our inheritance! You had no right!" "I had every right," I said quietly. "It was mine." "You selfish bastard!" Vivica lunged toward me, and for a second I thought she might actually try to hit me. Marcus Bellamy, standing nearby, stepped between us. She whirled on him instead. "Get out of my way! Do you have any idea what he's done? He's destroyed our lives! Destroyed them!" I looked at my daughter, 39 years old, shaking with fury over money she'd never earned. Money she'd simply expected to inherit like it was her birthright. And I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret. Just a strange, clear-eyed certainty that I'd made exactly the right choice. Was I wrong to feel that way? Lorraine recovered faster than the kids. She always did have a talent for calculating her next move. She pushed through the crowd to Rufus Trent, who was standing near the bar with his arms crossed, watching the chaos with professional detachment. "That donation can be contested," she said, her voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "We were still married when he made it. That makes it marital property. I'm entitled to half." Rufus didn't even blink. "Mrs. Finch, your husband established an irrevocable trust before making the donation. The funds never touched any account in his name. Legally, he never possessed the money the trust did. And the trust's sole directive was charitable distribution." "That's convenient," she spat. "That's airtight," Rufus replied. "I wrote it myself. You're welcome to hire an attorney to review the documents, but I can save you the legal fees. There's nothing to contest. The money is gone, and it's not coming back." Lorraine's face went white, then red, then white again. She looked around the room like she was searching for allies, for someone to validate her outrage. A few people looked away. Most just stared. "You planned this," she said, turning back to me. "You've been planning this for months. You wanted to humiliate me." "No," I said. "I wanted to do something good with blood money. The humiliation was just a side effect." Her hand came up fast. I saw the slap coming and didn't move to block it. Her palm cracked across my cheek, hard enough that my head snapped to the side. The room went completely silent. I straightened up slowly, my cheek stinging, and looked at her. "Feel better?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out of the hall. Her heels clicked across the floor in the terrible quiet. Nobody followed her. The party began to dissolve after that. Not dramatically, there was no mass exodus. People just quietly started gathering their things, making polite excuses, drifting toward the exits in twos and threes. But something strange happened as they left. Marcus Bellamy stopped on his way out and shook my hand. "That was the gutsiest thing I've ever seen," he said. "And the Veterans Children's Fund is a hell of a cause. My cousin's kid got a scholarship from them." "You did good, Harlan." Grace Caldwell hugged me, tears in her eyes. "My nephew's getting counseling through that fund," she whispered. "After what happened in Kandahar." "You saved his life." "Probably. Thank you." One by one, people I'd known for decades stopped to shake my hand, to thank me, to tell me stories about the veterans and children the fund had helped. These were people who'd probably gossiped about my wife's affair, who'd pitied me or judged me or dismissed me. It wasn't everyone, Some left without a word, their faces carefully neutral. But enough stopped that I lost count. The kids stood together near the back wall, a tight cluster of rage and shock. Vivica was on her phone, probably calling lawyers. Thane was red-faced and silent, staring at me like I was a stranger. Only Soleil looked conflicted, her eyes still wet, her arms wrapped around herself. I wanted to go to her, to explain, to see if that whispered apology had been real, but I didn't. Some distances can't be closed in a single night, and maybe some aren't meant to be closed at all. By 8:30 the hall was nearly empty. The caterers were packing up untouched trays of food. The bartender was breaking down the bar. The slideshow had ended, leaving just a blank screen and a quiet projector hum. My family sat at a table near the back, 20 feet away. Close enough to hear me if I spoke, too far away to matter. I walked over to the cake, that absurd three-tiered vanilla monstrosity Lorraine had insisted on. Nobody had touched it. The little fondant figures on top were still pristine. A man and a woman holding hands, frozen in perpetual sweetness. I picked up the cake knife and looked at the empty room. "Anyone want cake?" I asked. Nobody answered. The caterers packed up the untouched cake that night. I never found out what happened to it. By the time I got home, the house felt different, emptier, but also lighter, like someone had finally opened all the windows after years of stale air. 3 months later, I sat across from Lorraine in Marcus Bellamy's mediation office, watching her face as he delivered the settlement terms. The lawyer's voice was steady and professional when he said $30,000, but Lorraine's face crumpled like paper. Marcus Bellamy, the divorce mediator, had handled hundreds of cases in his 23 years of practice. But he'd told me privately that he'd never seen anything quite like ours. He was 51, graying at the temples, with the careful, neutral expression of a man who'd learned not to take sides. Today, that neutrality was working overtime. "The marital estate totals $30,000, he said, sliding a document across the table. "That's calculated from joint savings and your share of home equity under DC's equitable distribution law. The house itself was Mr. Finch's sole property prior to marriage, so it remains his." Lorraine stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. 30,000. "Yes, ma'am." "And the trust fund?" Marcus glanced at me, then back to her. "The trust fund Mr. Finch established was separate property, fully documented. Those funds never entered the marital estate. Legally, they were never his to divide. The trust owned them from the moment of establishment, with irrevocable charitable intent." I watched her hands shake as she picked up the pen. 40 years, $30,000, $750 per year of marriage. The math was brutal in its simplicity. "Where do I sign?" Her voice was barely audible. Marcus indicated 3 places with small yellow tabs. She signed all 3 without reading them, her signature getting sloppier with each one. When she finished, she set the pen down carefully, like it might break. "Do you have family or support during this transition?" Marcus asked. It was a standard question, part of his protocol for high-conflict divorces. He probably expected her to mention the kids. Lorraine laughed a short, bitter sound. "Dashiell left 2 weeks after the party. I hadn't known the exact timeline. I kept my face neutral." "I'm sorry to hear that," Marcus said, his mediator voice smooth and practiced. "Don't be." Lorraine looked directly at me for the first time that day. Turns out he was only interested in the version of me that came with money. Funny how that works. There was a moment where I could have said something cruel. Something about irony, or karma, or how it felt to be valued only for your assets. But looking at her, 63 years old, sitting in a mediator's office signing away the last pieces of a marriage she'd destroyed, I just felt tired. "I hope you find something better," I said, and meant it. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. Then she gathered her purse and walked out, without another word. Marcus waited until the door closed. "That was generous of you." "Wasn't generosity," I said. "Just truth. She deserves better than Dashiell Kemp." Most people wouldn't see it that way. I stood up and shook his hand. Most people didn't spend 40 years with her. Dashiell had been a lifeboat that turned out to be painted cardboard fine until it touched water. Lorraine had thrown herself overboard expecting rescue and found herself sinking alone. I could hate her for the affair, for the humiliation, for 37 years of small cruelties. But watching her drown didn't make me feel vindicated. It just made me feel old. The newspaper came out 6 days later. I was eating breakfast at Mabel's Diner when Dale Pritchard walked in, holding the Brooklyn Gazette like it was the Declaration of Independence. He dropped it on my table, tapping the full-page spread in the local section. "You see this? The Veterans Children's Fund had taken out a full-page tribute. My name was in bold at the top. Harlan Finch, transformative donor. Below it, 3 columns of text describing the donation, the fund's mission, and what $2.8 million would accomplish: scholarships for 180 children, 3 years of counseling services, emergency housing assistance for 70 families. At the bottom, a quote from the fund's director. "Mr. Finch's extraordinary generosity will change the lives of hundreds of children whose parents served our country." This is philanthropy in its purest form, giving not for recognition, but because it's right. "Everybody's talking about it," Dale said. "Whole town knows what you did." I stared at the page, feeling something I hadn't expected. Exposure. I'd imagined the donation as a private act, a way to do something good while making a point. But privacy was never realistic. Was it? Revenge is supposed to feel private. But generosity has witnesses, and witnesses have mouths. By the end of the week, I couldn't walk into the hardware store without someone stopping me. The pharmacist framed the newspaper article and hung it behind the counter. The VFW Post invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. 3 different church groups asked if I'd share my story. People I hadn't spoken to in years called to say they'd always known I was a good man, which was a lie, but a kind one. The children didn't call, but everyone else did. By Friday morning, my phone had rung 11 times before 9 a.m. Old friends, former colleagues, people I'd worked with decades ago. They all wanted to tell me variations of the same thing. "You're a good man, Harlan. You did the right thing. We're proud to know you." The newspaper sat on my kitchen table that evening, the full-page tribute visible in the fading light. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the missed calls. 12 now. 13. 14. Somewhere across town. Lorraine was living in a rented duplex with $30,000 and no one calling to tell her she'd done the right thing. And somewhere else, maybe 3 different somewheres, my children were seeing that same newspaper article, reading about their father's generosity, remembering their applause. I wondered if any of them felt ashamed yet. I wondered if shame was even possible for people who'd spent their whole lives expecting everything and earning nothing. My phone rang again. I picked it up. I answered on the 15th ring. It was Vivica. Vivica's voice on the phone was different, softer, practiced, and I knew immediately she needed money. "Dad," she said, "I've been thinking about the party, about what I did." I waited. Silence is useful when someone's building up to a lie. "I made a mistake. I know that. I was angry and I wasn't thinking clearly. So I wanted to say, I'm sorry. And also, I need..." "Stop." I kept my voice level. "If the next word is money, this conversation is over." She paused. I could hear her recalculating. "It's not like that. I just thought maybe you could help with a short-term loan, just until..." I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. I unplugged it from the wall. 3 weeks later. Thane showed up at my door wearing a suit and carrying a folder. "Business plan," he said. "Investment opportunity." He apologized within 2 minutes, quick, efficient, rehearsed, before launching into his pitch. "Just $20,000 to get the business stabilized," he said, spreading printouts across my kitchen table. "Then I'll pay you back with interest, guaranteed returns." I looked at the papers without touching them. Charts, projections, numbers that probably meant nothing. "You drove 2 hours to ask me for money," I said. "No. I drove 2 hours to apologize and present a legitimate business opportunity." How many times can you hear, "I'm sorry, but," before you realize the comma erases the apology? He stared at me. "You want forgiveness or you want money?" I said. "Pick one. You can't have both today." "That's not fair. I'm trying to make things right by asking for $20,000. I stood and opened the door. "Respect is earned, not bought. Come back when you mean it." He gathered his papers in angry silence and left without looking at me. His tires spun gravel, pulling out. I'd known they'd come eventually. Vinica and Thane had spent their lives treating me like an ATM. And people don't change their nature just because they get embarrassed at a party. They were sorry they'd been caught, sorry the money was gone. But they weren't sorry for who they were. Some apologies are just negotiations with different words. 2 months after Thane's visit, I was in my workshop reorganizing pipe fittings when I heard footsteps on the gravel. I looked up expecting a customer and saw Soleil in the doorway. She looked different. Thinner. Maybe you're just tired. Jeans and a plain jacket, hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked like she'd dressed for work, not sympathy. "Can I come in?" she asked. "It's your choice." She stepped inside slowly, looking around at the tools on pegboards, the scarred workbench, the smell of PVC cement and metal shavings. I went back to sorting fittings, giving her space. "I'm not here for money," she said finally. "I know that's what you're thinking, but I'm not." I kept sorting. 3/4-inch elbows in this bin, 1/2 inch in that one. I've been working at a call center. Customer service for a cable company. It pays rent. I got my own apartment, small but mine. Good for you. I'm not asking you to be proud of me. I don't deserve that. Her voice cracked slightly. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to fix things. My life. I set down the bin and looked at her. "Why are you here, Soleil?" "Because I don't know how to fix anything." She gestured around the workshop. "Not pipes, not relationships, not my mistakes. I thought maybe if I learned to fix one thing, I could learn to fix the rest." "You want me to teach you plumbing. I want you to teach me whatever you're willing to teach me." She met my eyes. "I know what I did at that party. I clapped when Mom humiliated you. I tell myself I was in shock, but that's a lie. I understood. I just didn't care enough to stop it." The honesty hit harder than any apology. "And now?" I asked. "Now I care." She wiped her eyes. "I don't know how to make up for 32 years of being a terrible daughter. But I thought maybe I could start by learning what you do, by spending time with you, by trying to understand who you are instead of what you can give me." I studied her face. No calculation, no rehearsed phrases, no business plans. Just my youngest daughter, asking for something I'd wanted to give her for 3 decades. My time, my knowledge, my company. "Tuesday mornings," I said, 7 a.m. Don't be late. 7 a.m., Tuesday morning. Soleil showed up at 6:45. She came in work boots and old clothes, carrying a thermos and a notebook. No phone, no excuses. Just ready. "We're replacing a water heater on Maple Street," I told her. "You'll carry tools, watch, ask questions when appropriate, and do exactly what I tell you. Understand?" "Yes, sir." We worked 4 hours. She took notes, asked smart questions. Didn't complain when I had her haul the old water heater up the basement stairs alone. Or when her hands got dirty. Or when the homeowner ignored her completely. Afterward, Back at the workshop, I asked if she wanted to keep going. "Every Tuesday," she said, "for as long as you'll have me." I walked to the storage shelf and lifted down the toolbox, the one my father had given me when I started my apprenticeship 43 years ago. The toolbox was 43 years old, worn smooth in places where my hands had gripped it 10,000 times, and now my daughter's hands would learn the same grip. I set it in her hands. The weight of it, 15 pounds of metal and memory, made her eyes well up. "Start here," I said. She carried that toolbox to her car like it was made of glass. I watched her set it carefully in the trunk, adjusting it twice. When she looked back at me, her face said everything words couldn't. A year had passed, and I woke every morning without regret, which was more than I'd managed in the previous 40. The workshop looked the same. Pegboards hung with wrenches, organized by size. Coils of copper pipe stacked in the corner. The faint smell of flux and PVC cement. Morning light filtered through the window, catching dust motes floating lazy and golden. I was replacing a shutoff valve for Mrs. Henderson on Oak Street, simple work. The kind I could do half asleep. Some men my age were retiring to golf courses. I was still crawling under sinks at 64, and I'd never been happier. The money was gone. Every cent of that inheritance had gone to children who'd never know my name. I still drove the same truck, lived in the same house, charged $45 an hour for service calls. Nothing had changed, except everything had. "You're the guy from the newspaper, aren't you?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "That donation to the Veterans Fund." "Just a plumber doing what needed doing," I said. "My nephew got a scholarship from that fund. He's studying engineering now. Because of you." I didn't correct her. The donation wasn't because of me, it was in spite of 40 years of mistakes, thinking money could substitute for boundaries. But she just needed her sink fixed. Money is like scaffolding, useful while you're building something. But if you never take it down, you can't see what you made. I'd spent 40 years building what I thought was a family. Holding up the framework with cash and silence and swallowed anger. The inheritance had been my chance to remove the scaffolding. Turned out there wasn't much underneath, just Lorraine's cruelty. The kid's entitlement. My own exhausted compliance. But also, unexpectedly, one daughter willing to start over. Vivica was working retail now, manager at a department store in Dover. The texts came every few weeks, updates, nothing deep. "Working doubles this week." Forgot how tired real work makes you. I'd text back simple encouragement. We weren't reconciled, exactly, but we weren't enemies either. Thane had found construction work, labor, not management. He'd texted last month, "Boss said I'm getting better, might make supervisor next year." The pride in those words was small but real. He'd never had to earn pride before. Everything had been given. Now he was learning what it felt like to build something himself. I hadn't forgiven them. Maybe I never would. But I'd stopped needing their apology to live my life, which was close enough to peace. What's the difference between revenge and teachingly? Maybe just whether you care if they learn. I did care. More than I wanted to admit. The party hadn't been about hurting them. It had been about showing them that respect isn't optional, that cruelty has consequences, that some things matter more than money. Whether they learned wasn't up to me anymore. The workshop door opened, letting in April air that smelled like rain and fresh-cut grass. Soleil stepped inside, pulling her hair back into a work ponytail, tool belt over her shoulder. 6 months into her apprenticeship, she moved around the space like she'd always belonged here. "Morning," she said. "What are we working on?" "Galvanized replacement over on Maple. Whole house needs repiping, starting with the bathroom." She nodded, pulling out her notebook. She'd filled 3 already neat handwriting. Detailed diagrams, questions in the margins. She was a better student than I'd been at her age. A car pulled up outside, a blue sedan I didn't recognize. A young woman got out, wearing business casual and carrying a purse the size of a small suitcase.
That's Maya, Soleil said. College friend, picking me up for lunch after the morning job.
Maya Thornton, 29 years old with an easy smile and a firm handshake. Stopped by the workshop. She looked around with open curiosity, taking in the tools and the organized chaos.
This is my dad, Soleil said.
And there was something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Best plumber in Brookland. He's teaching me the trade.
Maya grinned.
That's so cool. My dad's an accountant. I have no idea what he actually does all day. I used to feel that way, Soleil said, glancing at me with a smile that made my chest tight. Now I can't imagine doing anything else. Pride looks different on a daughter's face when it's earned through work instead of bought with someone else's money. She'd been ashamed of me once. Ashamed of the truck, the trade, the calluses on my hands. She'd wanted a father who wore suits and managed people, not one who fixed toilets and crawled through crawl spaces. The inheritance had been her lottery ticket to a better life, and I'd given it away. Now she stood in my workshop, introducing me with pride, wearing work boots and learning to thread pipe, understanding for the first time that respect isn't about how much money you have. It's about what you build with your own two hands. Maya left after a few minutes of small talk. Soleil and I loaded the truck with supplies and headed to Maple Street. We worked side by side for 3 hours, her handing me tools, me explaining each step. Both of us falling into the easy rhythm that comes when people actually want to learn from each other. On the drive back, she asked about soldering techniques for tight spaces. I explained the trick my father had taught me: angle the torch low. Let the heat rise naturally, don't force it. She wrote it down at the next red light. That night, I stood alone in the workshop where my father had taught me to solder copper 45 years ago. Soleil's repair kit sat on the bench beside mine. Smaller, newer, but learning the same lessons. I'd given away millions, lost a wife, kept only one child, and somehow, I'd never felt richer. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 40 years thinking that if I just worked harder, provided more, kept my head down, my family would respect me. I was wrong. I enabled their entitlement by never demanding the respect I deserved. Don't make my mistake. Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're necessary. Silence isn't peace when it comes at the cost of your dignity. I should have spoken up decades earlier. This isn't just a revenge story about money. It's about understanding that some people only value what you can give them, not who you are. True respect can't be bought with sacrifice or silence. When I gave away that inheritance, I wasn't punishing my family. I was freeing myself. I believe God put me through this for a reason. Sometimes the hardest lessons teach us that peace comes not from being loved by everyone, but from respecting ourselves enough to walk away from those who never will. If this revenge story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a choice between peace and being right? Would you have handled this differently? Please share this story if you know someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more real-life lessons. Every revenge story teaches us something. I hope mine taught you that self-respect is worth more than any inheritance. Thank you for staying until the very end. I truly appreciate you being here. One final note. While this story is based on real experiences, some details have been fictionalized or adjusted to protect privacy and emphasize the lesson. What matters most is the message, and I hope it stays with you.